Welcome everyone back to the Open Applied Linguistics Symposium. It's a great pleasure that we have Dr. Kevin McManus, Associate Professor at Department of Applied Linguistics, Pennsylvania State University, to give us a talk on replication research in applied linguistics, what, why, and how. I hope you enjoy it, and over to you, Dr. McManus.
All right. Okay. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I wanted to start by thanking the organizers for putting on such a rich display of open applied linguistics research on a variety of different topics. And the focus of my short presentation here is about replication and replication research as it kind of pertains to what's going on in applied linguistics at the moment. Briefly, I'm obviously not going to be able to do that much in the time that we've got, but the slides are going to be available. So if I have to kind of skip through things, you can go and consult those. You'll also be able to access a variety of different resources that I'll be talking about from my website, which is available on the link to that website is available on the conference program page as well. Okay, so yeah, so basically I'm going to talk relatively briefly about three different areas. I'm going to begin with like a kind of quick reflection on the place and role of replication research in how academic disciplines are kind of like organized and how kind of disciplinary conversations kind of take place, okay, and how replication kind of like plays a role in that. Then I'm going to talk quite briefly about the status or what's going on in terms of replication in our field in applied linguistics. And then finally, I'm going to finish up with some recommendations for carrying out replication studies in the field of applied linguistics. Okay, so I'm going to start, as I said, by just thinking about like how could replication research play a role, or how does it need to play a role in like our everyday conversations and thinking about what it means to learn and use an additional language. And so I'm kind of going to start from the 1940s, right? Because like from that point of the 1940s, our field was really starting to get to grips with trying to understand how is it that we learn and use an additional language, okay? And as you can imagine, a lot of that work beginning from the 1940s, going right up to what we're doing right now, has led to a variety and quite a lot of hypotheses and claims about how second languages are learned and used, okay? And so just like a brief kind of like list of some of those key ideas are the age plays a role, right? So those of you who are working maybe with children or adults or underrepresented groups or looking at language learning over the lifespan will be aware that age is thought to play some role, right, in how languages are learned. It might facilitate, it might impede, blah, blah, blah. You know what I'm talking about. Affective factors, motivation, anxiety, recent discussion about grit, things like that. These are thought to play kind of like roles on the trajectories of second language learning. Transfer or cross-linguistic influence. There's been a lot of work trying to understand to what extent the experience and knowledge of other languages that learners bring to the table might play a role in the learning of a new language. How input and the quality and extent of interaction might also influence learning. Noticing stages of learning, i.e. that there are some ideas that learners go through set stages of acquisition, right? Prompted by what we call the morpheme order studies, right? So like what we have here is just a real small list, just to give you an idea that like our field, the field of applied linguistics, is kind of characterized by these main ideas. Some of them are theories, some of them are hypotheses, but we could just very loosely call them just claims right now about how languages are learned, right? And these are ideas that are based on research findings. And really, I would say that they do constitute a very large extent to what we know about how people learn additional languages, okay? And so if we just take one of those, right, such as the stages of learning, we can see a very rich trajectory of research going on there, right? So you go back to the 1970s. So this seminal work by Bailey, Madden, and Krashen was the first study with adult second language learners, which was an extension of Dooley and Burt's 73, which was based on child L2 learners, right? So you can see that extension from starting with children, moving on to adults, right? And these studies are part of the morpheme order studies, which showed that first language background appeared not to influence the order in which morphemes such as S and ing, for example, were acquired, okay? And so Bailey et al. In 1974 was a major turning point in our field of adult second language learning, okay? It showed for the first time that first language learning and second language learning might not be that different, okay? Both types of learning were thought to be driven by the same internal learner mechanisms, right? And it was very consistent with thinking at that time. Chomsky and linguistics was taking hold of the field of linguistics. It was extending to language acquisition, second language acquisition as well, okay? And so that's just, what we got there is just one example of how many of our key ideas, right, or what we might call field turning points in the field might be attributed to a very small set of extremely influential studies, right? That kind of trajectory that I was talking about is just one example of that, okay? So age, noticing, affective factors, transfer, all of them, right? They all begin somewhere, right? They all started with a very small number of extremely influential studies, right? And what these are extension studies, then take the findings of that initial study, right? They develop them, apply them to new contexts with new populations and new applications, right? And so we've seen that, right? So Brown started morpheme orders in first language with children, okay? Dooley and Burt in 73 looked at morpheme orders in L2, but with children, right? You can see how this is an extension moving from L1 to L2. Bailey et al., morpheme orders in L2, but with adults, right? So sticking in L2, but changing the content or changing the population to adults. Dooley and Burt 82, morpheme orders in L2 children, but looking at a wider variety of L words, right? So you can see how this trajectory is moving, right? Well, we're taking those initial findings and we're investigating them with new populations, right? In this kind of example that we've got here, okay? And so this is extremely similar to many other disciplines, right? Applied linguists have worked extremely hard to accumulate a body of knowledge about how we do appear to learn additional languages, right? And so you might be saying to yourself, okay, but so what? Like, what has this got to do with the conduct of replication studies, right? And so if we just take as an example of that Bailey et al. Study from 74, right? I've said this, and like, you know this as well, that it constitutes a major root, right, of what we know about how languages are learned. So if you look at just, so I looked the other day, Google Scholar, so this single paper had 1,475 citations. It typically receives something around 100, 120 citations each year, right? So even though this study was immensely influential for shaping our field, right, it continues to exert major influences on our field, right? Those of you who know something about SLA theory or language texturing theory will be aware of things like the input Krashen's input hypothesis. Again, immensely influential, which took its impetus from those early morpheme order studies, right? And so, yeah, what we've got here is a majorly influential initial study about how second languages are learned. Big impact on theory, big impact on the field today, very strong implications for language teaching, very strong implications for theories about how languages are learned, right? Many of Krashen's ideas about how language teaching are known and quite often practiced by teachers, such as the affective filter hypothesis, right? Comprehensible input, things like that, right? And so one question that we should ask ourselves, like, is it surprising that like a foundational study such as that one, right, that I mentioned, the morpheme model studies, has never been replicated, right? A good question to ask ourselves is, what do you mean by it's never been replicated? Well, what we're saying is that no study has actually repeated the procedures of that first study and compared the results to that initial study, okay? Studies, for sure, right? There is no denial that studies have explored those Bailey et al. Findings in new ways, new populations, new contexts, etc., etc., etc. Right? We know that people have like developed and extended those findings, right? And studies have tried to explain these findings in different and novel ways, right? But it's not until relatively recently that we've started to revisit some of those claims. And what's kind of surprising is that this hasn't happened until relatively recently, even though we know that that Bailey et al. Study has a very large number of methodological limitations, right? And those methodological limitations have been an area of constant reflection and critical kind of elaboration of the years, right? And you can see that in a recent study in SSLA by Murakami et al., right? But this wasn't a replication study because they were using different methodologies, right? So this all kind of leads us to think about, okay, but why replication, right? We know that replication has been a constant subject of debate since at least the 1970s, right? And at that time, these debates mostly focused on, can you actually replicate a study? I.e., is it feasible? Is it acceptable, right? Is it acceptable socially as well to basically try and replicate someone else's study, right? Do we actually even need it, right? We've seen recently claims that science is self-correcting, right? If science is self-correcting, do we even need to bother with doing replication research, right? And you know, as you can imagine, a lot of these debates never really go anywhere. They lead to very little uptake and very few replications really have been undertaken, right? And we know that from recent syntheses of replication research in our field, right? Now, this does contrast with some other disciplines in social science where replication is a cornerstone of the research process. What we mean by that is that like an integral component of doing research is revisiting well-established claims, right? And like critically evaluating and repeating the methodologies of those previous studies is understood to be a long accepted means of advancing knowledge, understanding, and theory building, right? Why? So what do we mean by that? Well, what we're saying is that replication is, by saying it's the cornerstone of the research process, we're saying that it's essential. It's an essential and established part of how we carry out research, how we understand the world, right? It can lead to greater confidence in the research findings that we're using, right, to develop theories, right? And it can provide us with a stronger, more stable footing to carry out future research programs, right? So where does replication research fit into the research cycle? Is it that different, right? Part of this, I think it's important to think about is like when you carry out a research project, where does the stimulus for doing that research project come from, right? And in most cases, it's very likely that your current research project is an extension, right? And what we mean by that is like you're looking on taking a body of understanding, a body of knowledge, and applying it in different ways, in new ways that we think have not been done before, right? So we saw that with the morpheme studies. Like doing it with children, doing it with adults, doing it in L1 with children, doing it in a variety of L2s with children, doing it in a variety of L1s. You can see how these are always taking you in a new direction, this quest for originality, right? So you might use a previous studies methodology to produce new data using a new context with new participants, new populations, right? And I think it's important to think about what is the principal aim of your research project, right? Is it to take what we know in new and different directions, which is typically the case, right? Here, the aim is to extend what we know and apply what we know, right? And in these kinds of extension studies, our principal aim is not to critically revisit a previous study's procedures and outcomes, right? Obviously, when you do extension research, previous work helps contextualize your findings, but it's not your principal aim, right? Your research project is looking at extending a line of research rather than revisiting a previous study, right? So for me, a useful kind of like summary of this is a replication study systematically repeats a previous study with or without changes to contribute a better understanding, a more nuanced understanding of that study and its findings, right? But an extension study builds on what we know about a particular phenomenon by taking previous research in new directions, applying it in new contexts and things like that. And for me, a useful way to think about it is like if you visualize this kind of research process, right? When you're doing an extension study, you're looking back. You're looking critically at that previous study and you're repeating it intentionally, right? When you're doing an extension study, right, you're looking forward. You're asking yourself, well, let me take what I think we already understand, informed by a large number of studies perhaps, and I'm looking to take us forward, right? I'm looking to take us to like unexplored areas, changing the population, things like that, right? But you come at a replication research from the same position, all right? So here we go. The principal aim of a replication study, therefore, is to critically question, revisit, and reconsider a previous study's methodology, right? And it's the methodology of that specific study that you're curious about. And that's why you return to the methodology, right? And clearly in an extension study, you're likely going to make comparisons, but it's not the objective of what you're doing. You're not setting out to repeat the methodology of one previous study, okay? So this is, I'm just like summarizing. So I want to move on to what's going on in our field, right? In applied linguistics, after we just talked a little bit there about replication from like a kind of general perspective. And clearly, like, I certainly think that, and I think our field thinks so as well, that replication is clearly relevant to what we do, right? It's clearly relevant because we are interested in building theories, right? We're interested in advancing knowledge, the field of applied linguistics, understanding and theory building. And we do that by revisiting previous studies in a systematic way, right? And so, for example, repeating a study to evaluate the extent to which chance or unexpected factors may have contributed to the nature of that study's conclusions, right? Like this is clearly very important to what we do as applied linguistics, right? So for example, in the department that I work in, the research that I'm reading, we're really kind of interested in how context plays a role, right? We're really interested in how instruction or differences in the type of instruction influence learning, right? We're also interested in to what extent do the nature of the conclusions depend on how the analyses were conducted or the types of measures were used, right? And as applied linguists, I think we're all agreed that these are really important factors, right? Because we know that they can exert very important influences on the types of conclusions we draw, right? Replication So this is why replication is important to us. It's also another way to think about it is taking the limitations of a study, right? So we have studies now which more clearly acknowledge the ways in which a study is limited, right? Instead of just moving on, right, we can integrate those into the design of our next research project, and then repeat it rather than just moving on to the next thing, right? And even though we can do that, we don't do that, right? It's not a part of our research culture for whatever reason, right? And so we have seen how the lack of doing replication research can erode or can kind of like affect the credibility of a particular discipline, right? So I don't need to go into this too much, but like we've seen what was going in our neighboring sister disciplines in social psychology and cognitive psychology, right? Here are just some of those headlines from not so long ago, right? Leading to this kind of provocative conclusion that, ironically enough, it seems that one of the most reliable findings in psychology is that only half of psychological studies can be successfully repeated, right? And so we're aware of like how that can affect, right, what goes on, right? So the so-called replication crisis was taking place in 2015, right? And these are just some of what was going on, right? So the basic point is that many of those very influential findings could not be replicated, right? So the same kind of conclusions couldn't be met, right? And so we can see how this lack of systematic revisiting of previous research can affect a discipline, right? And so we can think about it, right? How much confidence can we have in what we do if the things that we take to be dear and important either are not, cannot be replicated or are impossible to replicate, right? When I say impossible, like it could be the case that like you've got some very influential studies, some areas which we hold to be very important, that like we have no idea how those data were collected or analyzed or things like that, right? And another thing to think about is how that impacts the users of our research. So as applied linguists, that's going to be policymakers, right? That's going to be educators and things like that, right? And so what you can see is that like, if we don't understand the nature of our field's conclusions, right, how are the users of our research going to be able to make use of that? And you know, consistent with other disciplines, replication has not been well represented, is not well represented in our field, right? So we have seen studies in second language acquisition, and I'm going to say that I think that does stand out as a major supporter of replication in the field. So from the 1990s, the editor at that time was saying the way to more valid and reliable research is through replication, right? And the problems of reliability and generalizability are best resolved through attempts at replication. So I mentioned that. We see context as being super critical to what we do, right? But so which kind of goes back to that generalizability component, right? Replication is the way that we address that, right? Sue Gass has noted in many of her editorials why and how replication is so important to what we do, right? There's going to be a special issue dedicated to replication studies in that journal, okay, in the next couple of years, right? So even though the place of replication has been heavily debated, so I mentioned in the 70s, started in the 70s, moving on. So even though we've been talking about it a lot, we've had over 70 calls for replications. We've got book-length treatments about how to carry out, how to do replications. We've got narrative reviews and meta-analyses of like replications, right? The understanding is very little is carried out. So Marsden et al. In their reviews of the field estimated that only 1 in 400 studies is replicated in our field, right? Now, this isn't radically different from other disciplines, right? So you look at education, very similar. Psychology, communication, business and marketing, very similar, right? Marsden and Clark's review of submission guidelines in psychology journals found that only 3% explicitly accepted replication studies, right? We're beginning to see things changing in our field, which is immensely encouraging. So we're seeing that journals are now explicitly including replication studies in their guidelines, right? So here are just a few examples, right? We're seeing online repositories that are allowing authors to upload their data collection materials. And this is really important to be able to carry out replication studies, because if you don't have those initial materials, you have to recreate them, right? And that process of material recreation naturally is going to change things, right? So Iris and OSF are good examples. Book length treatments are providing hands-on training in how to carry out replication studies, okay? And there is the development of methodological and analytical practices in our field. And those are really helping more clearly present our analyses, right? So such as descriptives, visualizations, things like that, okay? So the question is, okay, so what's going on in applied linguistics? So why don't applied linguistics researchers seem to be carrying out replication studies, right? I would say that, like, in some sense, we're encouraged to do it. And some of the time we're supported to do it as well, right? So such these journal initiatives, things like that, right? But, right, if it's only 1 in every 400, right, the chances are we're not going to see many examples of what a replication study looks like. We're probably not going to have a very good idea about how to design a replication study and how to carry one out, right? Never mind interpret one, and never mind write one up, right? And we might think that replications are less prestigious or original than extension studies, right? So Paulton Richards in 2012 was saying, replication is regarded as low prestige, mundane, unoriginal, and non-academic, and therefore not encouraged by faculty. And in Marsden and Tell's review of the field, they saw a lack, they talk about a perceived lack of prestige, excitement, and originality of replication is plaguing L2 research, but just as it is in other disciplines, right? And so I was kind of curious to look at this in more detail, right? And so, so I provided here a link to a study I recently carried out, and I wanted to better understand what are the attitudes of researchers in the field towards replication, and what are their practices when they do carry out replication studies, right? To get this idea, or to better understand, are people not doing them because they don't value them, right? Or is it something else, right? And so this was a survey with 354 participants in our fields, in the field of applied linguistics, right? And what I'm doing is I'm just providing you with a snapshot, right? If you want to find out more info, right? And so what that survey indicated were actually very positive attitudes towards the place and value of replication in the field. So researchers judged replications to be valuable. They judged them to be relevant, and they judged them as strength in a discipline. And again, this is just a snapshot, right? And so what you've got here, right, is you've got a chart, and you are going from the left-hand side to the right-hand side as like don't agree, or strongly disagree to strongly agree. And what you can see here is that these accounts, right, the majority of counts are kind of like counted in this very strongly agree rating. Okay, so we've got that. Participants disagreed with claims that replications lacked innovation and originality, despite some of those early claims in the field, right? And then there were other questions in the survey, other findings that kind of reinforced these viewpoints. So when people were asked, would you support graduate studies to carry out replication studies? People were saying, yes, we do. And some people were very explicit that they encourage students to do replication studies as part of the training process. Would you recommend other researchers to carry out replications? Overwhelmingly, yes. Do you think that the amount of replication in the field should increase? Overwhelmingly, yes, right? So what we're seeing in this sample are quite positive attitudes towards doing replication studies in applied linguistics, right? In terms of replications, so these were, sorry, in terms of practices, these were for those who had actually carried out at least one replication study, right? And so just to give you an idea of who these people were, these are the different career stages. So we got PhD students, postdocs, assistant professors, associate professors, and full professors. So in each of those categories, about half of the people had experience carrying out a replication study, okay? So what we found was that partial replications, people declared as being the most common types that they're doing. Just over half of these replications reached the same conclusions as the initial study, right? 75% of people said that they had presented a replication study. So remember, these are the people who carried them out, right? So 3/4 of those who had done a replication study had presented at a meeting or conference, right? Just over half of the replications have been published in a peer-reviewed journal, right? But almost 25%, so almost a quarter of completed replications were not published, excluding those submitted or in preparation, right? Which for me is quite sizable, right? Half of replication, I think this is an important point, half of these replications were not explicitly labeled as such in the title or abstract, right? So what that means is that we are likely going to have close to half of replications in our field as not being explicitly labeled as replication studies, right? And for me, this is a problem, right? Because replications play a very particular role in advancing growing the discipline, right? But if we don't know they're out there because we can't find them, right, then their potential to shape conversations, right, are being reduced. So overall findings suggesting that researchers do appear to judge replication studies as being valuable and relevant, right? So that's kind of difficult to kind of make sense of, right? Because previously we had thought, right, or we think that people don't carry them out because they see them as being not very valuable and not very relevant. But that doesn't seem to be the case, right? So how do we explain that? So these negative attitudes don't seem to be the sole reason, right? But for me, it seems that reporting and dissemination practice are playing an important role here. So if you just take that Mars and et al. Review of the field, right, you just look at the studies that were included in that review, only 13 of the 63 of those articles included the word replication or something like it in the title, right? So you contrast that with something like Alzawat's meta-analysis of meta-analysis in ELT, right? And there what you've got is 84 of the 90 meta-analyses included the label meta-analysis or research synthesis in the title, right? So there's something going on there. Like people who are doing meta-analysis seem to be more willing and want to include meta-analysis in the title, right? People who are doing replication studies don't appear to be using the word replication until you get to the methodology section, right? And in a small number of cases, they're including it in the replication, in the abstract. Most times, they're not even including it in the title, right? And so it seems to me that explicit labeling can improve the discoverability of replication research. And I think this might help us understand, right, why replications appear infrequent, right? Is it that they're infrequent, or is it that they're just not being highlighted or indicated as being replication studies, right? So it seems that what we might be perceiving as a lack of replication could be a lack of transparent labeling. Now, obviously, this is driven by a variety of very complex decisions and reasonings, right? People make decisions as to what they put in the title and the abstract of their paper. Like choosing to omit the word replication is underlying something, and it's up to us to understand what that is, right? And this is definitely, for me, this is definitely a question that we have to return to in a few years' time, because we are seeing increased dialogue around replication and open science and research methodology, right? And I think, to me, I'm seeing some changes in how people are talking about their research, right? And so it might be the case that we're seeing more and more willingness to indicate, hey, I'm doing a replication study, or this is a replication study, right? So in the last few minutes, I'm just going to finish up with some recommendations for carrying out replications, right? And so I'm going to start with this first one. This is super critical, is that replication is defined by comparison, right? So you do a replication study in order to make comparisons with some previous study, right? So replication should be approached with this very clear idea in mind. So if you're not drawing comparisons between your replication and that initial study, right, then this is something that you need to address, okay? So the researcher has to ensure that they understand what went on in that initial study inside out. They want to be asking themselves questions about feasibility, right? In order to draw comparisons, there has to be some degree of similarity. The more that it's different, the more difficult it is to draw comparisons, right? When you write up the replication, it's really important to be clear to draw those systematic comparisons, right? So pointing out what was similar and different between the studies, right? When the materials are the same, what was different? So making clear the studies differed in these ways or were similar in these ways. This is what I mean by replication is defined by comparison, right? Don't change too much, right? A common mistake in replication study design is that too many changes are made, right? And the more things that are different between the studies, the more difficult meaningful comparison is, and the less of a replication study it actually becomes. Because remember, when you do a replication, your aim is to repeat the methodology to better understand, right, how that study's methodology led to those particular findings. So some types of changes are more difficult than others, for sure. And maybe you don't consider all differences to be important changes. It's just important to be upfront and clear about what was similar and what was different. The third point, and I just got one more brief one after this, you need a motivation. So when I'm reviewing replication studies and things like that, the number of times a replication study lacks a motivation or a rationale for doing the study is surprising, right? And you need a reason for doing the replication study, right? And a replication without reason is the largest obstacle to publication. When variables are modified, we need to explain why they were modified and how they were modified, okay? And we want to be changing things intentionally. And then the last point I'm going to say is like, include the label replication in the title and the abstract, right? Now, this is a recommended practice, but I think it's worth repeating, okay? And for me, this is one way to improve the discoverability of replication studies, right? Is by using transparent labeling. And then I think that we can begin to at least address the concerns about frequency and quality of replications if we can find them, right? But unless we can find them, i.e. they're discoverable, it's going to be difficult to understand our approaches and the extent of replication in the field, okay? And I'm going to end here. So I mentioned this book at the beginning, Doing Replication Research and Applied Linguistics, right? So you can consult this text. It has models for writing up, considerations for doing replication studies, etc., okay? So I'm going to finish there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin, for your wonderful presentation. It's very clear, and you have highlighted what is replication and why does it matter, and how can we better implement replication studies in applied linguistics. Now the audience have several questions for you. The first is, as you can check in the Q&A box, what do you think about studies that try to disprove or question the findings of previous studies? Are these valuable, and how do you frame them?
So revisiting previous research, right, is extremely critical to what we do. Otherwise, there are no checks, right? There are no balances on how we grow theories, how we grow disciplinary knowledge. Now, whether our starting point is a desire to disprove, for me, is thinking about it wrong, right? Or just thinking about it differently, right? Because I don't think that we should be starting our approach to replication shouldn't be based on our desire to disprove a particular study or author or something like that. Like, we have to start with an open mind and say, it is entirely possible that this study did lead to these conclusions because it was novel in these ways, right? And there are a very large number of examples of that in our field. But that's why we do replication research, is to basically understand these questions, right? Did this methodology lead to these results, right? And you would probably approach replication with some kind of like doubt, or you would think to yourself, oh, it's kind of, given what we know about this topic, it's kind of surprising that this study led to these conclusions. And you might have a hunch and say, I think it's because of how they operationalize these variables, or how they measured these variables, or how they collected data or something like that. And that would be your basis for approaching replication. And for me, that is entirely valid, okay? But it's a different one from setting out to disprove a theory or something like that.
Thank you. And another question is it worthwhile even trying to replicate qualitative studies? Or what do you think of that?
Yeah, so there are a good number of articles and chapters which talk about this, right? And so there's a really interesting book that was published in 2006, edited by Patsy Duff, and she brings together a variety of applied linguists from a variety of different backgrounds. You know, as I said, one of the things that we're interested in applied linguistics is context and how context plays a role, right? And for me, the principles of replication hold across all of the types of research that we do, right? So basically understanding how context plays a role and things like that. And so there are a good number, so I will direct you to Numamaki has a nice paper where he's talking about this, published in Language Teaching in 2015, and he's coming from a conversation analysis perspective. But for me, the principles of replication apply across methodologies, okay, and I don't see them being not relevant to qualitative research, but the way in which we might approach it might be different. But absolutely, the principles of replication research apply.
Yes, thank you. And what's your criteria, general or specific, to determine which studies to spend resources replicating?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a really good question. So there is a paper that just recently came out by Isker et al. In psychology, trying to develop some kind of typology for how to determine which articles are valuable and which should be replicated in psychology, right? And I think it's worth having this conversation at the same time in applied linguistics. And this is something that I'm working on right now. But what I would say is that like our reasons for replication should come from a critical and close reading of that initial study, which is something that I've talked about in my writing and in the book that I recommended. So it might be that you've got a study that kind of like bucks the trend in a field. It might be that like you think that the ways of like variable operationalization were kind of could be improved upon or changed, or the study design could be altered in some way. And for me, these are all very valuable. Looking at things like impact on the field, many people have used that as an index, right? So you would see, for example, people suggesting that we should only really be replicating studies which appear to be kind of like informing current debates, right, as well. So for me, there are a variety of different rationales or reasons for carrying out a replication study. And I'm going to draw this comparison, just as there are a number of different reasons and rationales for carrying out an extension study. And this is why replication research is not that different from any other type of research that we do. We just need a reason for doing it, right? And our reasoning can come from a variety of different places. And for me, in our field, there isn't a single or small number of criteria that are going to say, hey, resources have to be dedicated to this 1, 2, or this small number of studies, right? But it might be the case that as we think about this more as a field, right, we might be able to come up with some framework for determining investing resources, right? But right now, I would say that the extent and amount of applications in our field is still in its kind of junior stages. So I just don't feel that we've got to that point of making a clear-cut determination as to what's worthy and not worthy of application.
Thank you. And maybe one last question for you. Would there be things that replication can do that open science or register reports cannot do? And for example, how replication can complement or be relevant to open scholarship in applied linguistics?
Yeah, so actually I have, so I mentioned on my website, so that I've written about this topic, about the kind of the ways in which replication research works with the aims of the principles and practices of open science, right? And these things are moving in lock and step together, right? And so, for example, what you've got is your ability to draw on and use the materials that other studies are making available. What we're seeing is replication studies reanalyzing existing data sets. For example, what we're seeing is making replication studies open and accessible, such as open access publishing, the use of preprints and postprints and things like this, right? In order to get the message out there, in order to get the contribution of replication research out there, right? And so, yeah, absolutely, replication is working together, working with, and benefiting from and contributing to the principles of open science, for sure.
Yes, thank you. Very clear and informative answers. And we also have wonderful comments from Dr. Luke Plonsky about the frequency of replications labeled as such may actually be higher than Professor Marsden and colleagues found, since some of the studies may not have been identified, as you said, they may not have label replication in their title or abstracts, and also additional explicit and field-specific standards and guidelines on how to conduct or report replication studies might help here. And yeah, and Luke provides some references that you can check out.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much.